It's turned colder. How long will the cold weather last? Will there be any more snow? And how can you prepare for cold and snowy weather? I'm Aidan McGivern. Welcome along to another Met Office Deep Dive. We do these every Tuesday, and every Tuesday we encourage you to subscribe so you don't miss them in the future. Now, eagle-eyed viewers will notice I'm not alone this week. I'm very pleased to say that I'm joined by Will Lang, friend of the show, head of situational awareness here at the Met Office, previously chief meteorologist as well, so plenty of expertise with us on this week's Deep Dive.
Hi, Aidan. Good to be with you again today.
Hello, and we're going to be talking about what the signals are for the next week and beyond in terms of potential cold, potential snow. What are the uncertainties? Why we can't say anything for sure when we're looking more than a week ahead. And we're also going to be talking about how people can cope with cold and snowy weather.
That's right. That's my job, really. So my job at the Met Office, I'm in charge of weather warnings, but also in charge of the advice that we give to people, but also to government as well and emergency services.
First things first, did you get any snow yesterday?
A little bit. I was out about 9 o'clock last night. I live in Taunton in Somerset. A few flurries, a few grains of snow on the roof of my car when I went out, but nothing really settling. There was a bit around though.
Yeah, there was. We got a bit in my house, and kids got very excited about it. Here's the radar that's on a loop from the last 24 hours. Much of this was snow. It did start a bit sleety in the southeast, but actually we got increasingly cold air from the east mixing in with it by the time it moved through central southern England, and then eventually into south and mid Wales, the southwest. Much of that was snow. Nothing particularly heavy, but all very exciting for people in the south like us living in Devon.
We don't see it often, do we?
We don't get much down here. So when it does happen, we get very excited about it. A stark contrast, of course, compared to the last few months. Let's take a look at this. This map is quite extraordinary. It shows the amount of rainfall from the 1st of October 2023 to the 3rd of January 2024 compared with the 4-month period of October, November, December, January. So it shows how wet it has been compared with the 4 months of October to January. Across eastern Scotland, of course, Storm Babette brought such a huge amount of rainfall there, and we've had other rainfall events since then for eastern Scotland. And eastern and central parts of England into the south as well. Just shows already this month we've seen in places 1.7 times the rainfall we'd expect between October and January.
Yeah, it's been really wet across a large proportion of the UK. You can see those wet spots. Again, you focused in on things like Storm Babette for eastern Scotland, also parts of the East Midlands. But actually, there's been successive weather events, successive bands of rain coming through the autumn and over the Christmas and New Year period, which have really taken things to these above average levels. So it's been a really, really wet few months.
Yeah, and that's highlighted. If I show another map here, it takes some explaining, but it really highlights the track of these areas of low pressure. Now, it might be difficult to make it out here, but there's the UK, so there's France and Spain. This is the Atlantic out here. And what this is showing is for the autumn season, 2023, it's the anomaly in terms of the wind at around the jet stream height in the atmosphere. And the blues show where the jet stream was stronger than normal, and the reds and oranges show where it was weaker than normal. So normally you'd expect through the autumn the jet stream to be sort of running between northwest Scotland and Iceland, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's right. Mostly the storm track will be across the Atlantic. We'll have low pressure systems or storms coming in across Northern Ireland and Scotland, giving most of the heavy rain to northwest Scotland. And this graphic shows how it's all been shifted that little bit further south, and that's made all the difference over the last few months.
I mean, the number of times I talked about south-shifted jet stream in my forecast since October, November, December, and what that made a difference to was the track of those lows, as Will was saying. This shows the same sort of thing. There's the UK, and it shows the sea level pressure anomaly. So the blues there indicate much lower than normal pressure. Now, we typically have low pressure in the autumn in the UK, so this is even lower than normal pressure across southern Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, Wales. Not as low in terms of the anomaly for northern Scotland.
That's right. And the other crucial thing to throw into the mix here is that if it comes further south, the low pressure systems, then these areas are less used to getting that large amounts of rainfall. I mean, places like West Wales, North Wales will see a lot of rain, but In some cases, the storm track has been even further south than that. In some cases, the storm has come from the southwest and then curved up through central and eastern England, Storm Babette, for example, and that's given all that rain to parts of eastern England, eastern Scotland as well, where they are not used, and the rivers are not as used to that amount of rain.
Yeah. And we saw a similar pattern continue into December. So again, this is the south-shifted jet stream in December, and the result, low pressure, this time particularly across central southern Scotland into northern England, but lower than normal pressure across the UK. Higher than normal pressure of Greenland, out in the Atlantic, and for northern parts of Norway and Finland. But yeah, it's...
So I guess the summary here is that we've had what we call a mobile weather pattern, a zonal pattern in meteorological jargon, where systems are coming in from this direction, from the west to east across the Atlantic and hitting the UK. And that's what's been the driver behind all of the wet weather.
So that explains why it's been so wet. We've had a lot of storms, named storms as well. What explains why the jet stream's been shifted south and we've had low pressure, a mobile westerly and so on?
Well, to explain this, we look at all of the other big drivers going on in the atmosphere, and there are things happening all the way around the world, patterns that combine in a certain way to result in the jet stream being where it is for a certain period of time. For our seasonal forecast, we've always been talking about El Nino this year, and that's about ocean temperatures in the Pacific, but actually that plays a big part in weather across the North Atlantic. It has knock-on effects to where the jet stream is. It can result, on average, when we have an El Nino year in the Pacific, in getting a wetter, stronger jet stream in the first part of winter in the UK. It's not always the case. There are other players involved, other patterns around the world, but that did look as if it was going to have a strong influence this year, and that's proved to be the case in that we've had this wet autumn and wet start to the winter with a strong jet stream slightly shifted southwards from where
it's been a textbook example, hasn't it, this year? And we're going to be talking more in a moment about what El Nino means for the next few weeks and months. But before we do that, something has changed in the atmosphere this week. Of course, we're talking about the jet stream, and instead of low pressure, I should say, it's high pressure now firmly in charge. And at first this week, we've seen this easterly airflow, which has brought some very cold air into the south.
Well, again, we're following the isobars. So where are the isobars coming from? They're coming from this way round the high. Where is that coming from? It's coming from, well, central northern Europe, originally Scandinavia. There's been some really cold conditions. You may have seen, we've had minus 40 or something like that in parts of northern Scandinavia. Not that cold when it gets to us, but it does get slightly warmer as it comes across the North Sea and across northern Europe. But this is really the cold air we've been digging into from the continent. So that's why we've got this decidedly biting feel, particularly where it's windier across southern parts of the UK at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising how quickly it's turned colder. It just goes to show that if you get the winds coming from a particular direction, the weather can suddenly change, and quite dramatically. I mean, in Devon, for it to be snowing early evening and settling, even just light snow, just shows how cold that source air is that we saw arriving. But it's not going to stay that cold this week, is it? If we just run that forward, in fact, we'll skip forward a day or so. This is Wednesday, so tomorrow at the time of recording. And what we're seeing here is the high pressure just meandering slightly. And what it seems to do is it brings more of an Atlantic influence all the way around the top of it, so it's not a raging southwesterly, but it does bring a bit more of that Atlantic influence. And it's worth saying at this point, actually, that the colours on here represent the air at 5,000 feet or 1,500 metres, and it looks really quite warm, but at the surface we've still got chilly air.
It's still cold in comparison to what we're used to in the first half of winter, certainly. So while it might not be quite as cold, there's probably quite a bit of cloud around here, so it might not be quite as cold at night in terms of severe frost, but it still feels cold in comparison to what we've had.
Yeah, it just indicates that anything falling from the sky is mostly going to be rainfall over the next few days. We'll see some drizzly showers over the Pennines, over eastern England and so on. But many places, actually a reasonable week of weather finally some dry.
Well, again, you said the dry conditions. I mean, that's really, really important given how wet it's been recently. Lots of flooding around the last few weeks. So the fact that we do have some time to dry up, for those flood conditions to recover somewhat, that's really, really good news.
Yeah. But as we go through the week, of course, things start to get more interesting. In fact, come the weekend, this is Friday, there's a front moving into the north. It's a cold front, although at the surface, as mentioned, it's still going to be relatively chilly. But this cold front represents a change in the air mass again. So we're going from a bit of an Atlantic influence there, something less cold, to the Arctic. And if you follow the isobars, those winds are coming straight from the north. By this stage, we're into Sunday, so it's a relatively slow-moving cold front. It's going to bring a bit of rain. But the important thing is it's going to bring us a change in the weather, isn't it, by the end of the weekend?
That's right. Again, there'll be a resurgence of really cold weather, I think, the end of the weekend and then spreading further southwards across the UK in the early part of next week. And as you said, it's coming from the Arctic originally. That means there'll be plenty of showers around the coast, snow showers as well. That's
really where we start next week. I just want to show you some scenario maps. These are highly simplified, just to make things clear. Of course, as we go into next week, it's 6-7 days away, so we can't give the highly detailed forecast, but we can just give you an idea of the kind of setup we're looking at the start of next week. And this is how we start things, isn't it? We've got this northerly airflow, snow showers, especially for those areas exposed to the northerly. But actually, I love a good northerly because you get a lot of sunshine, don't you?
Really cold but crisp conditions, really sunny inland, away from the snow showers. It can be quite nice as long as you're away sheltered from the cold and have taken precautions.
Yeah, that's key. Then, interesting things start happening. The Atlantic wants to come back in, and what we've got here is low pressure trying to make inroads from the southwest. And here's where things get more uncertain.
Yeah, we're not sure about the detail of this at all, really, but what we can tell from all of the different forecast models is there is a tendency to start to push low pressure back in from the southwest. The problem that gives us is when it reaches and starts to interact with the cold air, that cold northerly, which is already across the UK. So you get moist, warm air starting to come in, low pressure from the southwest, and then when it reaches the cold air, you tend to get snow. We can't tell where that will be, we can't tell how long it'll last, how heavy it will be, but these are the kind of situations where you can have some quite significant snow events for some parts of the UK. So certainly want to keep a really close eye on, particularly as we head into next week. Looks like we're okay for right at the beginning of the week, just this cold, crisp northerly, but then a lot to look at, to play for the second half of the week in particular.
Later Tuesday into Wednesday, Thursday, we're looking at this. Different models are saying different things in terms of the track of these lows and so on. But really, you've got all the ingredients there, haven't you? You've got the cold air in place. You've got the additional moisture supply coming up from the Atlantic with the potential for some heavy, persistent rainfall, which then mixes with the cold air. And so at some point on the boundary, you'll have this area of significant
That's right.
snow.
We could have a low pressure system coming up in this direction. We could, sorry, I've messed up the screen there.
I'm always doing that. I need to build it better.
We could have actually things turning to rain quite quickly in parts of the southwest, depending on where the track of the low goes, but somewhere in between, that zone in between, where we get the rainfall abutting against the cold air, that's where you can get some potentially prolonged snowfall.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually, if you look at the temperature trend graphs for two extreme parts of the country. So we've got Aberdeen on the left here and Plymouth on the right. And what these show is, again, the temperature trend at 5,000 feet, 1,500 metres, because that's useful for ignoring the kind of day-night differences and the noise to do with that. It's much more useful at showing kind of air masses and so on and general trends. It'll be difficult to see the day, I understand that, but what's important to see here is this is Aberdeen, and you've got the temperature trend. It actually goes up through the next few days as the Atlantic influence comes around that high pressure. Then, through the weekend, this is Saturday, Sunday, the bold line is the main run of the European model. This is all the dotted lines in the shaded areas are the various ensemble runs. So the European model run at slightly lower resolution than the main run, but just to give us an indication of the differences in the different computer model runs, or whether they're all very similar.
And they're all saying the same thing in this case, aren't they? Really? There'll be a downturn in temperatures, certainly for Scotland, the early part of next week, or in fact actually over the weekend.
Yeah. That's okay. I'm every time I'm doing it. So then it stays cold through next week.
Yeah.
And good agreement there for Aberdeen. But come on to Plymouth. The main run there, the bold, has it turning much colder for the start of next week. Then it jumps up again, and that would indicate that the main run is pushing those lows in and pushing milder air in. However, the extent of that spread there, a lot of disagreement for the likes of Plymouth about whether it stays cold, whether you get the milder air, and so on.
Well, you could look at that and say that actually the bulk of the model solutions are saying that it wants to keep it in relatively cold air at that stage, but there's a lot of spread, as we say, so a lot of uncertainty in the forecast. Some of the forecasts pushes that milder air, some of them don't, so there's a lot to play for in terms of the timings and the track of these low pressure systems as they come into the southwest.
And just the graph on the bottom here, this is the precipitation, so all the different runs with various spikes, but it just indicates that as we go through next week, so Monday to Friday for Aberdeen, there's just that increased chance of precipitation. Of course, Aberdeen in the cold air, much of that might be wintry. And then Plymouth there, even greater spikes because closer to those sources of moisture coming up from the Atlantic. Whether that's rain or snow or sleet is the main source of uncertainty. But we'll obviously keep a close eye on that. Alex Deacon will have more in the 10-day trend tomorrow. But that's all we've got in terms of the rest of the week or so. I just want to show you this finally, and this looks at the next 2 weeks. And really what we're seeing here is the probability of different weather regimes or weather patterns for each day. So we start at Tuesday, time of recording, go out to 2 weeks Tuesday. And various weather patterns are represented by various different colours. The dark reds there are the kinds of patterns that we're seeing over the next few days. So generally blocked patterns where you've got high pressure close to the UK. Then the blues that start erratically making an appearance from early next week represent that Atlantic influence, don't they?
So this is the increasing chance of low pressure starting to exert an influence from the Atlantic across the UK. And so what we can see is that increase through next week, as we've been talking about. And so by the time we get to the end of next week, it's actually finely balanced as to whether high pressure or low pressure is the dominant influence over the UK. And the fact that they are in quite close proximity means that we've got a bit of a battleground set up for the UK, where the high pressure and the cold air is never too far away, but neither is the moisture-bearing low pressure systems from the Atlantic. And that's why we do have some concern about there being some snow events at some point over the next couple of weeks.
So it's not just that first event with that low moving up, it could repeat itself.
This could be the setup we have for a good portion of the rest of January.
Yeah. And with that in mind, we've been talking a lot about mild air, obviously storms, wind, rain, whether the flooding was on the news quite a lot last week. What do we need to start thinking about now in terms of cold weather? Actually, before we move on to tips, the most important thing obviously is to stay up to date with forecasts and warnings and so on.
That's right. Met Office forecasts, and really keep a close eye out for Met Office warnings, particularly if we start to talk about snow warnings next week. Make sure you stay in touch with those, change your plans accordingly. That's the main advice, I think. But I'd also say there's other advice that you can tap into, keep an eye on. Health alerts, for example, from UKHSA for England, or equivalent advice from the other health agencies of the UK. Really, really important. Some really, really useful advice there for keeping yourself and your families and your communities protected in cold weather.
Because we've seen that there have been some cold weather alerts issued. What's the difference between those alerts and the weather warnings that the Met Office issue?
That's a really good question. They're frequently mistaken, and actually they're closely connected because we work really, really closely with UKHSA. They use our temperature forecasts to come out with the alerts. They work in a slightly different way, though, slightly different audiences. The weather warnings from the Met Office, they are focused on everyone, the whole community. So we want everyone to know that there's snow coming along and taking appropriate action. The UKHSA cold weather alerts are slightly more targeted. There is some really, really good advice for everyone, and I would urge people to go to their website to have a look at the cold weather tips there. But there is specific advice targeted on healthcare professionals, social care, the voluntary and community sector, and other vulnerable groups as well. So being able to target those groups with that specific advice around cold weather can really, really save lives, and that's really important. So it's worth taking note of those warnings too.
Ultimately, that's why we do what we do. We do these forecasts and try and get the information out there on YouTube and many other via many other means to keep people safe. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, that's right. And then that leads us on to talking about the general advice that we give to people through winter. And that's part of our Weather Ready campaign for the Met Office. We link up with other partners to give their advice as well. So that would include, probably things that people would say are obvious, like as we head into a cold snap, make sure your boiler is working and your heating is working and it's properly serviced. Make sure your pipes are properly insulated. Make sure you know where your stop tap is in case you get some frozen pipes or things like that. So that's just in the house, but lots and lots of travel advice as well. Stay in touch with the warnings. Make sure you have some supplies with you in case you get stuck in cold weather and snow. Loads and loads of advice on the Met Office website under Weather Ready.
And these useful tips as well that we've got now. Weather hacks, we'll go through a few now, but if you've got your own weather hacks or tips, let us know in the comments. It'd be good to hear about those. Here's one, cardboard covers for your windscreen wipers. Yeah,
so this with some advice we've sourced with our partners in the RAC. So a lot of people do this already. Saves the need for lots of scraping in the morning if you put these under your wipers and on your windscreen. Another suggestion here is not necessarily cardboard covers, suggesting that you might use some old socks. Underneath the windscreen wipers to stop them getting stuck.
Because if they get stuck, you turn your engine on, you start wiping the engine, they can get stuck, the engine can overheat.
Yeah, so a little hack to save some time and to keep yourself safe in those conditions.
And never pour boiling water, of course, on the frozen windscreen.
Not a good idea.
No. Capped and cosy. If you cycle in the winter, here's a hack. Wear a swim cap under your helmet. Don't worry about what you'll look like. I don't think anyone will care. The important thing is you'll be staying...
I have not yet done that one. Have you, Aidan?
I've got a balaclava. I haven't tried that one out. I don't know whether that would be warmer.
I would imagine that's pretty toasty and warm.
It would be, wouldn't it? Yeah, I'm not sure how that would feel. It would have been useful a few months ago in the wet rides. I think that one. There we go. I've got a dog. Clean paws, healthy pups. If you've got a pet.
Well, again, we can look after ourselves, look after our families. Looking after our pets in cold weather can be as important as well. So if you're taking them out and about on their daily walks, make sure that they've got clean paws and they're not going to pick up anything or cold conditions have an adverse effect on them.
When the paths and pavements are gritted and so on, that can be potentially damaging to the paws. Flask up to warm up, that's a good one.
So this could, there are people who go winter swimming even at this time of year, New Year's, for example. And so specific advice here about warming up afterwards, making sure you've got a flask of hot drink or soup with you. But that could just be going outside normally. It's good to get outside, good for the mental health during cold and sunny weather, but make sure you keep warm and have a hot drink afterwards.
Absolutely. Tagging your tap as well, so
making sure you know where your stop tap is. It does happen, particularly when you get to the end of cold weather events, as things start to warm up again. You can get frozen pipes and then they thaw and then they burst. That can happen, unfortunately. Probably quite a low chance, but it does happen. So in the eventuality of it happening, make sure you know where your stop tap is to be able to turn it off should you have a burst.
Definitely worth knowing that sort of thing. And wearing thin layers as well. This is useful to know.
Yeah, again, it's probably pretty standard advice. It's a better way to dress for cold weather when you're going in and out of doors. Multiple layers, fleeces and undergarments underneath, etc., is probably a better way to do it. You can take them on and off as you need them, rather than one big thick jumper, for example.
So there you have it. Plenty of weather hacks, weather tips. If you've got any of your own, let us know in the comments. And just very briefly, we talked about it turning colder. We've talked about the potential for these battlegrounds events with some significant snow in place. Earlier on, mentioned El Nino and how that caused such a mild and stormy and wet start to the winter. What would El Nino tend to suggest for the rest of winter?
Well, this is where I'm going to bring in lots of caveats again, because it's still really, really uncertain. So one thing I'd like to say is don't necessarily believe everything in terms of the detail you might see on specific forecasts for 3 weeks' time on social media. That's really, really difficult to do at this stage. So be a little bit sceptical. But based on the pattern that we've seen in winter so far, which is to have that wet bit at the middle, and that seems to be consistent with an El Nino pattern, you do tend to have a colder end to the winter. So this is from now all the way through till March, which isn't to say it'll be cold all the way through. There will doubtless be wetter periods. Could even be some more named storms. But overall, the odds suggest, based on the El Nino conditions and the other drivers in the atmosphere, that things will tend to be drier and colder in the second half of winter.
Yeah, so things are pointing in that direction, which is why we've got this 3-month seasonal likelihood of cold, average, mild, and this is for the January to March period, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So this needs some explaining, but what you would normally see at a normal, for a normal year at this time of the year, these percentages would be 20, 60, 20. And any shift away from that is an indicator of the shift of the odds towards one type or another. And there is a slight shift towards cold. In fact, it's more marked than that, actually, because recent years have been fairly mild in winter. It's actually more normal in recent years to have these numbers up towards mild 30, 40%. So the fact that it's lower than that and the fact that it's lower than 20% shows that the odds are stacked in the cold direction for the coming months. Again, doesn't mean that it'll be cold all the way through. It doesn't actually mean that it will necessarily happen. It just means that the odds are skewed a little bit in that direction.
Yeah, by looking at these various global drivers, you mentioned El Nino, there's also the Indian Ocean Dipole. A lot of these, we've got explainers for them on the Met Office YouTube channel, so the Indian Ocean Dipole. Stratospheric polar vortex as well. I'm sure we'll cover that in more detail.
Lots of jargon, lots of acronyms, abbreviations, etc. But they all fit together, and they're all interrelated, of course. So the fact that the stratospheric polar vortex tends to be weak at this time of year is related to how strong the jet stream is, and that in turn affects how strong the North Atlantic Oscillation is, which is whether we get storms coming in or whether we have blocked conditions across the UK. So they all act together.
So when we look at this as meteorologists and we say everything is favouring colder, thankfully drier as well, we can say the dice is loaded, right? It's almost like you load a dice in favour of 6, you're more likely to get 6 coming up, but you could still get the other numbers.
The way I like to think about it is sports punditry. So we might say, who is going to win the Premier League this year? We would probably have a good stab at it based on what's happened so far and what might happen in the rest of the season, but plenty of other outcomes, as we know, can happen.
Who's going to win the Premier League this year?
Well, I'm going to sit on the fence as I do with the seasonal forecast and say I couldn't possibly comment.
Brilliant. That's all we've got time for. Thank you, Will, for joining us. It's really useful to get some insights into how we look ahead beyond a week or so, and useful for some of those weather hacks as well.
Pleasure.
And if you enjoy this sort of in-depth look at the weather, we do them every Tuesday, as I mentioned. Please do hit subscribe. And we'll have more on next week's weather in the 10-day trend tomorrow. Of course, we'll be covering all the upcoming weather in our YouTube channels. So we'll keep you updated right here at the Met Office. But for now, that's all from us. Bye-bye.